A little while back, I put out a video about Distrobox, and overall it was fairly well received, and it's an incredibly useful tool. In case you missed that video, basically it allows you to run any distribution you want inside of a container on top of another distro. So say you're using Ubuntu as your regular distribution, but there is some tooling available on Arch Linux or Fedora or anything else out there that you want to use on your distro. Well, instead of running a VM or setting up a second distro, you can go and run that distro inside of Distrobox and then integrate that second distro in a container into your host system and run whatever you want. And following that video, someone wrote a blog post partially in response to it, not to criticize the video, but offer a use case of Distrobox that I and many other people hadn't really thought of. Toolboxes are not just for special use cases. Most of the start of this is just background about what Distrobox is and why other people are using toolboxes, and other people have covered it like Liam Dorr and obviously my video. The main thing starts here. One of the interesting things I found in the comments were people having a concrete use case for using a toolbox. It's usually one of the top comments when people talk about this class of software. They want Arch's AUR, but do it in a safe spot. Or they have an old deb or RPM from a piece of software that doesn't have a good packaging story on Linux, so they can bring that stuff with them. But this author provides a very different use case. Now, as I'm going through this, I am going to be slightly rewording things as there are quite a bit of grammatical errors, but I'll try to keep the sentiment exactly the same. What I'd like to talk to you about today is why you'd want to not just use a Distrobox when you need to solve a problem, but just as your native user space all of the time. One of the benefits of explicitly separating our OS and our user space is decoupling. They are no longer dependent on each other. So for me, my default Distrobox is my entire user space. So instead of picking and choosing applications that aren't being sufficiently handled by your regular distro and then doing that inside a Distrobox, basically keep your host system as simple as possible. Basically just install the distro and then install Distrobox and then do everything inside of Distrobox. Now the author mainly focuses around the terminal applications, but there's no reason why you couldn't extend this to basically everything on your system. Every GUI application and everything you want to run, stick it inside of the Distrobox. Now this might sound like an absolutely insane way of running your system, but in the server space, this is pretty common practice, and you do get some advantages. This gives me a few advantages, namely, every advantage you get when using containers on a server. Remember, I can copy, fork, snapshot, backup, share, all of this stuff since it's all in my container. It's always going to be with me forever. It's not just for Silverblue, MicroOS, SteamOS, EndlessOS. You can take this container on any distribution that you can run Distrobox and Docker/Podman. And the last time I looked into that, and you can check for yourself on the Distrobox supported list, this covers basically every distribution, even non-GNU systems like Alpine Linux. Now, let's say you're like me and you use Arch Linux, but instead of doing it the normal way, you install all of the applications you want to be using inside of a Distrobox. And then for whatever reason, you decide that Arch Linux isn't for you. You want to go over to something like Ubuntu. Let's say you don't like the rolling aspect of Arch and you want to have something that updates considerably slower. So you go over to Ubuntu. Now, normally when you go to Ubuntu, you would have to go and reinstall all of the applications you want to be using. But if it's all in a container, you can take that container over to Ubuntu, and it works exactly the same way. And then let's say you get bored of Ubuntu and you want to go to Gentoo. Well, it's exactly the same. You can take that same container and all of your applications are still working the exact same way. And then one day you go back to Arch and nothing has changed from the user space side. It's just your host system that you're occasionally swapping out. So for those who are terminally ill with distro hopping, I could see that actually being really compelling. But there is a lot more reasons than just this. Say you are using Silverblue and you want to install PHP. This will be done inside of a toolbox. And if you're on Arch, you can do the same thing and you'll be better off. And the same on Ubuntu, you'll be better off. Remember that on mutable systems, you really can't go back once the configuration drift starts to kick in. It's way too late. Unless you are very particular with what you install and what you keep around, the longer a Linux system exists, the more it is going to be cluttered with absolute nonsense. One great example of this is I still have Python 2 installed. I don't know why I have it installed. I didn't ever explicitly install it. Something I was using at some point in the past must have installed it. And then there's things like the language package managers. Let's say you start installing applications in pip, and npm, and gems, and go, and cargo, and all of this other stuff. You're going to have all of these things around that you don't know where they're being stored, how they're being handled, or anything like that. But if you do all of this inside of a container, if it ever gets way too cluttered, you can just say, you know what? I don't need this container anymore. And if you go and keep an installation script around that can reinitialize your container with everything you need, deleting that isn't that big of a deal. Sure, you can go and do the same thing with your host system, but reinstalling a distro on hardware is way more complex than just spinning up a new Distrobox. And sure, in the long run, you are probably better off keeping your system clean and knowing about everything installed on your system, not just having random things installed for seemingly no reason. But it's pretty easy to let go of that stuff and have things start to escape from you. But maybe that doesn't matter to you. What about a broken package? Development in cloud has proven that containerizing these workloads is way faster and more efficient for developers. And if you don't believe any of that cloud mumbo jumbo, think of it this way. Less stuff to break on host upgrades. Will stuff still break? Sure, of course it will. It's just way easier to recover from a broken package or upgrade in a container than it is on the host OS. If you are keeping good, frequent backups of your Distrobox containers, rolling back to a known good version is absolutely trivial. And yes, you can absolutely do the same thing on your host distribution. I know someone's going to tell me about Butterfs and snapshots. I'm very aware that that is a thing that exists. But rolling back a container is going to take you maybe 30 seconds to a minute at max. And sure, it's not going to take you like an hour to roll back with Butterfs, but it is going to take you longer. So at the end of all of this, you get to keep your core OS clean and small, so that we can have that well-tested, reliable, and maintainable, which is a necessity for long-term sustainability. Now, throughout this entire article, the author has only been talking about the benefits of doing this, but it's not like there aren't downsides as well. Most notably, making these distro containers and making their backups is not free. I don't mean not monetarily free, I mean storage space wise, because having all of this stuff inside of containers is going to cost a lot more storage than a regular user space running on your regular distribution. But like any storage space issue, whether that is actually a problem depends on your hardware configuration and the way you're using the rest of your system. Are you on a laptop with a 256 gig SSD? Or are you on a desktop with 3 terabytes of storage? And what are you storing? Are you storing high-res video? Are you playing a lot of games? Or do you have just a lot of text files? If the answer is text files and 3 terabytes of storage, well, doing this isn't that big of a deal. And, there's a mix in between that you have to decide whether trading this storage space is actually worth that trade. And whilst not as much as some other systems, there is absolutely going to be a performance overhead, most notably when first starting up the box, effectively booting up the operating system. And then when you're actually running the container, it is going to offer some level of overhead, having Docker running in the background, having this container running. I can't speak for every single system, but on a remotely modern system, it's not a major concern. But if you are in a situation where performance is incredibly valuable, then maybe this isn't what you want to be doing. And especially true for GUI applications, it's not just as simple as install the application in the box and then be done. Firstly, to make sure your X server is actually properly being shared with the box to make the GUI application properly function. But besides that, if you want to have things properly integrate into your desktop menu, or you want to have the binary actually available on your host system, you need to go and do some manual intervention to make sure that is actually happening. But since that step only needs to be done once per application install, it's not a major factor. And lastly, you're relying on Docker or Podman for your entire user space to function. Now, I'm not worried about upstream doing anything that's going to break the program. I'm more worried about the distribution you're using shipping a broken package, which, considering some of the stuff that's been happening recently, isn't completely impossible. But if none of those things are a major issue to you, it may just sound like I'm nitpicking, and really, I kind of am. I had never considered this to be a use case that you could actually do, but it seems like an absolutely viable way to use your system. It's not something that I'm going to be doing just because my system is so integrated with my host system already, but if I was going to do a new system, it could be worth at least experimenting with just to see how it's going to go. So have you ever considered living your entire Linux life inside of a container? Or maybe you've already tried. I would love to know your experience down below. So if you like this video, I'm going to go and like the video. If you really like the video and you want to become these amazing people over here, go check out my Patreon, subscribers, and Robertson, linked down below. I've got a podcast called Tech Over Tea. I've got a gaming channel called Brodie Robertson Plays. That's going to be it for me, and I want to sneeze.